France is in trouble.
France's political uncertainty continues to intensify.
Economy is in turmoil, debt is mounting, budget deficit has ballooned, and soon it may not have a government again.
The countdown has begun for President Emmanuel Macron.
In only a few months, the government has collapsed, its borrowing costs have soared, and for the first time ever, its debt has gone past $4 trillion, more than the entire economy produces in a year. This might sound like just another European debt story, and after all, other European countries have debt levels far higher than France. But France is different. It isn't just any country. It's Europe's second largest economy, accounting for nearly a fifth of the entire Eurozone. And if it ever failed to pay its debt, its shock wouldn't stop at its borders. It would ripple across Europe. Unfortunately, the warning signs are already there. It's been over half a century since France ended a year with more money left over. 51 straight years of spending more than it earns, with every government simply borrowing to cover the gap. This kind of spending can't go on forever, but every time France tries to fix it, chaos ensues. Since the 1970s, pensioners have enjoyed stronger wage growth than younger workers, and for the first time in history, retirees now take home more in pensioners than workers earn in wages. But still, nothing can be done. Politics is stuck. One party calls for higher taxes, another for spending cuts, and another for reforms, but no solution lasts more than a couple years. The cycle is always the same. A government is elected, it proposes measures, opposition builds, and then the government collapses, and the process starts over. Meanwhile, France's debt rises by €5,000 every second. Now people have begun to ask, what happens if nothing changes? If France can't bring its finances under control, the rest of Europe may be forced to step in, whether it wants to or not. And if this happens, the entire Eurozone could be in jeopardy. For most of the last century, France was a symbol of prosperity. It built one of the most generous welfare states in the world. If you got sick, the state covered your medical bill. If you lost your job, government unemployment checks kept you afloat. And when you retired, a pension was waiting for you. And from the moment a child was born, the promise was clear. Education, all the way from nursery through university, would be free. It became part of the French identity, a promise that the state would always protect its citizens. And for decades, that model seemed to work. Growth was strong, living standards were high, and France cemented itself as Europe's second largest economy, behind only Germany. The French system was admired, not just within France, but abroad, proof that a modern economy could combine capitalism with a powerful social safety net. But there was a catch. It came with a hefty price tag. And although taxes were already high, that price still needed to be covered with debt. In fact, every single year since 1974. For more than half a century, deficits were the rule, not the exception. And at first, this wasn't an issue. And that's because debt isn't always a bad thing. If it funds growth, especially long-term growth, it can even help a country prosper. And for decades, France did exactly this. The economy was strong, the workforce young, and millions of people were paying into the system, which made generous benefits feel sustainable. But in France, those benefits became more than just a policy. They became part of national identity. People came to expect the state to step in at every stage of life, to cover their healthcare, their pensions, or even months of unemployment. It wasn't just support, it was a promise. The problem was that over time, this promise got harder to keep. By the 1990s, France still had 5 workers for every retiree, but 2 decades later, this was down to 3. Pensions and healthcare began swallowing more and more of the budget, while the tax base needed to fund them kept shrinking. Normally, that kind of imbalance would set off alarms, but France was shielded by timing. The creation of the euro drove borrowing costs to historic lows. Politicians leaned on debt instead of reforms. After all, why risk sparking a protest when borrowing felt painless? From the outside, the system looked relatively stable, but underneath, France was going more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. And then the calm shattered. In 2008, the global financial crisis hit, and like everyone else, France was forced to spend billions to recover its economy. As people lost their jobs, families who once paid into the system now depended on it for survival. The flow of money reversed, less coming in through taxes and far more going out in support. In just 2 years, France's debt jumped from around 60% to 80% of its GDP. It was the first real warning sign, proof that France's system was more fragile than it looked, and this should have been the moment of reckoning. But while other countries like Greece or Spain, which were also suffering, were forced into painful bailouts, France slipped under the radar, quietly avoiding the spotlight. There was no urgency to change course, so instead of tightening its finances, France leaned on the European Central Bank's decision to cut interest rates. Borrowing was suddenly cheap again, and so the country doubled down on its debt. But things weren't like in the past anymore. France's population was older, the workforce smaller, and public spending kept growing every year. The same pattern continued to repeat. Dirt cheap interest rates hid the underlying problems. To politicians, this felt like free money, an easy way to delay tough decisions. As long as debt was cheap, reforms could be put off. They borrowed more, promised more, and year by year, the system became even more fragile. It was a gamble that worked, until one day it didn't, because then COVID hit. When the pandemic froze the economy, France had no choice but to yet again step in, with solitary funds, recovery plans, and state-guaranteed loans. It poured hundreds of billions into furloughs, bailouts, and emergency healthcare, and by the time the dust had settled, its debt had surged past 110% of GDP. For the first time since World War II, the country owed more than its entire economy produced. This is where the illusion finally broke. The French debt crisis was no longer just theory, it was reality. The truth is, France's welfare state was already too expensive to run without constant borrowing. Decades of deficits had been baked into the system, but the pandemic finally pushed it over the edge. The calm was over, and what remained was a spiral, and France was now fully caught in it. Their problem today isn't just that they owe a lot of money, it's that the country is stuck in a spiral, and nobody seems to know how to break out of it. The French welfare state was built in another era, a time when borrowing was cheap and the economy was booming, but that world doesn't exist anymore. Interest rates are climbing, the economy is slowing, and suddenly the cost of funding healthcare, pensions, and benefits feels a lot heavier. And here's where France really stands out. No other developed country spends as much on its public sector. For every euro the country produces, 57 cents of that goes towards the public sector. Take last year, France ran a deficit of 167 billion euros. Over 50 billion of that wasn't spent on schools, hospitals, or new infrastructure. It was just on interest payments, paying off debt on yesterday's promises. Add it all up and the country is overspending by about 6% more than the economy even makes. To put that into perspective, the EU's limit is 3%, and France is running nearly double that. In fact, it hasn't even met this spending target once since COVID, and it's not projected to change course anytime soon. And the reason the deficit keeps blowing up is simple. Most of France's money is tied up in recurring costs, obligations that can't just be paused or cut without sparking a crisis. And this is where we hit the real pressure point, as one expense in particular is eating the system alive: pensions. France now spends more on pensions than almost any other country in the world. Last year alone, that price tag was over 350 billion euros, which is 14% of the entire economy, far above the EU average of 10%. To put that into perspective, pensions now cost the French state more than it spends on education, defence, and transport combined. But the real issue isn't just how much pensions cost, it's how fast the balance between workers and retirees has flipped. When the system was first built, fewer than 15% of the population were retirees. The balance held. But today it's a different story. That number has already jumped to 22%, and by 2050 it's expected to be nearly 30%. Almost 1 in 3 people will be retirees. And it's not only that there are more retirees, they're also living longer. Today, the average French citizen lives for almost 11 years longer than 50 years ago, which means a decade more of pension checks, healthcare bills, and support longer than the system was ever designed to handle. For want of a better phrase, the French pension system works a bit like a Ponzi scheme, on a pay-as-you-go basis, where the money placed into the system is almost immediately drawn out to pay for pensions. However, it's not just that there are fewer workers, it's that those existing workers paying into the system aren't making up the difference. Productivity in France, once amongst the strongest in Europe, has dropped sharply in recent years. Part of the issue is structural. More young people are staying in school longer and collecting advanced degrees to stand out in the job market, but the jobs aren't there to match. Nearly 1 in 4 graduates end up in work that don't even require that level of education. Years of study, but little payoff for the wider economy. Instead of each worker generating more wealth to balance the system, output per worker is falling. So the problem is twofold. There are fewer taxpayers shouldering the burden, and each one of them is contributing less than before. And here's the caveat. Everybody in France knows the system can't keep going like this. Economists warn about it, investors see it, and even the government admits it. But every time leaders try to fix it, the country explodes. In 2023, more than 3 million people marched through the streets in a single day to fight Macron's pension reform. By international standards, what they were fighting against was modest, raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. For comparison, in Germany and Italy, it's already 67, and even in the US, it's 66. But in France, the reaction was explosive. Strikes shut down transport, garbage piled up in Paris, and protests went on for weeks. Polls showed that nearly 70% of the population opposed the reform, even though economists were nearly unanimous that it was necessary. And when Parliament resisted, Macron forced the bill through using a constitutional loophole. Instead of calming things down, it only deepened the anger, and his approval ratings collapsed, and the government barely survived a no-confidence vote. In the end, the reform technically passed, but politically it came at an enormous cost. Macron's party lost its majority in Parliament, leaving the government too weak to push through major changes, and every proposal now gets bogged down in negotiations and stalls before it can go anywhere. These struggles aren't just limited to Macron either. Every time a previous president tried to touch pensions, they ran into the same wall. Each time, streets were filled, strikes broke out, and reforms were watered down or abandoned. And that's the trap of the French system. The reforms are desperately needed, but any attempt to pass them is faced with either political opposition or an uproar in protests. Since 2022, France has already burned through 5 prime ministers, and no reform ever sticks, and for ordinary people it feels like déjà vu. One government makes a promise, the next one tears it up, and strikes go on, pensions stay under threat, and life keeps getting more expensive. Investors are watching closely. They're seeing rising debt, an aging population, and a government too divided to act, and confidence is slipping. That's a major shift. For decades, France was one of Europe's safest borrowers, a huge, productive economy, second only to Germany, and lending to France was considered risk-free. But once those debts start to creep in, lending doesn't come cheap anymore, and that's why France's interest rates are rising. Investors want more money in return for taking on that risk. France is already stuck in that loop, and it's only getting tighter. But these warnings aren't just coming from economists or think tanks anymore. They're showing up in the very places investors look first: credit rating agencies. The firms that tell investors how safe or risky it is to lend money to a country have already pushed France down to its lowest score in modern history. Confidence has collapsed, and the markets are flashing to prove it. For the first time ever, it's now just as expensive for France to borrow money as it is for Italy. And the deeper you look, the more unsettling the outlook gets. The numbers France are sitting at today look eerily familiar. In 2010, just before Greece's crisis exploded, its 10-year bonds were trading at around 3.3%. Right now, France is sitting at almost the exact same level. Back then, it only took a spark, a slip in confidence and a wave of selling for Greece's borrowing costs to spiral out of control. Within months, the interest rates shot up and the country was locked out of markets entirely. That's the risk France is flirting with now. As long as investors keep faith, the system limps along, but the moment they decide French debt isn't safe anymore, the spiral could accelerate at frightening speed. That's a huge shift in outlook. When the Eurozone's second largest economy starts to look shaky, it doesn't just spook investors in Paris, it makes the entire European project look unstable. And here's the real problem. Again, France isn't just a tiny country, it's 20% of the entire Eurozone, and if it runs into serious trouble, bailing it out wouldn't just be difficult. With a pile of 3.3 trillion euros, it might be impossible. Remember, the euro was built on a promise that every member state would keep their finances under control so the single currency could stay stable. That's why strict ground rules were set. No country should run deficits bigger than 3%, and debt should stay below 60% of GDP. But France, along with other countries it must be said, are not following these rules anymore, and that changes everything. If France can't keep its house in order, it undermines the credibility of the whole system. Why should investors trust the euro if even its core members aren't following the rules? And that's where the trouble really begins. France is simply too big to fail. If markets ever pushed its borrowing costs to a breaking point, the European Central Bank would almost certainly step in, buying French bonds to stop the panic. But think about what that actually means. The moment France gets that kind of rescue, other states will want the same. And if that happens, why would any government ever cut spending at all? Suddenly the Eurozone isn't being held together by discipline, but by the central bank's balance sheet. That's a line Europe has never dared to cross. The uncomfortable truth is that this is all unprecedented. The Eurozone has no real playbook for this. It managed bailouts for Greece, Portugal and Ireland, but those are all much smaller economies. France is nearly 10 times bigger than Greece. If it tips into crisis, the entire Eurozone would be forced into an impossible choice. Either step in and rescue them, risking political backlash in Germany and the Netherlands, or refuse, and let one of the founding pillars collapse. Either path would jeopardise not just France, but the euro itself. Another country which is also suffering with debt issues of its own is of course America. The US national debt has now surpassed $37 trillion, over 110,000 per citizen, with interest payments consuming 6% of GDP, more than defence spending. Economic vulnerabilities like these are being exploited globally, particularly by China, which once held over $1.3 trillion in US treasuries and now holds just $780 billion. Against this backdrop, security and sovereignty are back at the centre of US policy. Liberty Defense Holdings, ticker LDDFF, in the US market and the sponsor of today's video, are a firm developing next-generation threat detection technology for airports, stadiums and government facilities. Liberty Defense has attracted attention from agencies like TSA, DHS, DOE and Los Alamos National Laboratory, with exclusive licenses, cutting-edge patents and government-backed R&D. Despite raising $45 million to fund product development, the company's stock is trading near its all-time lows, with a market cap of roughly $16 million, a fraction of what it has already raised to fund development and deployment, creating a potential inflection point for investors watching the evolving US security landscape. The company's flagship product, Hexwave, was developed from the research at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory and advanced through partnerships with the Department of Homeland Security and Transportation Security Administration. It's a walkthrough portal that uses millimeter wave technology, 3D imaging and AI to detect both metallic and non-metallic weapons in real time. Unlike traditional metal detectors, Hexwave identifies plastic and 3D printed weapons while scanning up to 700 people an hour without requiring them to remove jackets, shoes or personal items. This makes screening faster, less invasive and more accurate, key to the TSA's goal of modernising security while cutting costs. The system has already been deployed at Los Alamos National Lab, and the TSA recently awarded Liberty Defense a sole source contract worth $6 million. This includes the HD AIT upgrade, which is the TSA's quest to retrofit about 1,000 body scanners with the new high-definition imaging technology. At a unit cost of $100,000 each, that's a potential $100 million rollout. The upgrades replace older scanners nationwide, with additional orders expected soon, and the TSA has already granted Liberty Defense with a $4.5 million sole source contract. These contracts are significant because sole source agreements are only granted when a company's technology is considered uniquely capable of meeting specific federal requirements. And with the TSA's April 2026 mandate requiring all US airports to begin employee screening for concealed threats, demand for Liberty technology could surge over the next year. In short, Liberty Defense is positioning itself as a leader in next-generation security scanning, combining cutting-edge technology, exclusive government relationships, and growing federal mandates. With shares near historic lows and a series of upcoming government rollouts, it's a company worth watching closely as the US pushes to modernize its security infrastructure. Visit libertydefense.com to learn more about the Hexwave system and its role in redefining public safety.